Yes, we are recording now.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. It's a fascinating and interesting and difficult topic. And, but from, a point of view of the profession, also a very important one. I know many of you probably already have a pretty good background in disaster risk and vulnerability, but I just wanted to start with a few comments about it just to sort of create a bit of a common understanding. The first one is when we talk about risk and vulnerability to disasters, it only has meaning with respect to the disaster you're talking about. So if you're going to say, are you vulnerable? Really, it only has meaning if you say vulnerable to what. And yes, there are some aspects of vulnerability which are very general and apply to most hazards. But really, you need to be specific in terms of the hazard you're talking about for the conversation to be meaningful. The second point I want to mention is that it's highly nonlinear. And nonlinear in a way which is quite different from many other social statistics. So we're used to dealing with normal distributions like the bell curve. But disaster distributions, whether it's risk or vulnerability exposure, typically follow fat-tailed distributions. As a result, the rare events are extremely important relative to the more common events. And when you have a fat tail distribution, which is one that looks like that curve I have up there, it's not only nonlinear, but the whole notion of means is not important. A mean gives you a lot of information for a normal distribution, but doesn't give you useful information for fat tail distributions. And often what's really important is having knowledge of critical thresholds that exist. Context is just very important for understanding risk and vulnerability. Unless you know the context, the cultural context, the social context, the environmental context, you're going to have an imperfect picture. And finally, there are certainly aspects of it which are fairly objective, like how many cyclones do you get per year, but also these things reflect what we care about. There are two sides to it, the more objective side, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, but also the values and subjective kinds of assessments that are part of risk and vulnerability assessments. So I just want to make those 4 points to sort of set up my talk and where we're going. So I've basically tried to pick out what I see as some of the most important aspects of doing risk and vulnerability assessments. I thought the first ethical issue is when not to do a risk and vulnerability assessment. It's an incredibly useful tool, risk and vulnerability assessments, and we have to do them. I mean, many places it's legislated, but it's just due diligence. But there are times when it's not appropriate. And if you're dealing with a problem which is a wicked problem or an ill-defined problem, then really it's not appropriate because the conditions that underlie doing risk assessments are not met. An example might be a good knowledge of probabilities or consequences if there's high uncertainty or a stakeholder disagreement. And in those sorts of situations, it's more appropriate to incorporate the precautionary principle, which is more of a philosophical, ethically based approach to dealing with risks, and addresses issues like burden of proof, distributions of power, duties, and social justice. So I would say that's the first kind of ethical issue that should be addressed. A second aspect is scale and duties of the public versus private sectors. So I just created a little graphic here. Just on the x-axis, I've got what I call political scale, and the y-axis, temporal scale. And risk and vulnerability really exist at all scales, from the local community, well, the household, individual and household really, up to national and international scales. And all of these different scales interact with each other. And if any of you are interested in more of a discussion of this sort of thing, if you look up Panarchy and the work that's been done on resilience, ecological resilience, and resilience of complex systems, there's some really interesting stuff there. But sometimes what happens in the local scale and the community scale is going to be very important in terms of what our risks and vulnerabilities are. But at the same time, our vulnerabilities and risks are generated by much larger scale things. So it may be due to a corporation that's on the other side of the world and isn't, like Bhopal, for example, that isn't doing what it should do, or policies at the state or national level that affect critical infrastructure that you depend upon. So, these sort of political and geographical scales can be important aspects. And one thing I've noticed here in Canada anyway, is that there's been a huge emphasis on community vulnerability analysis and risk analysis in managing disaster risk at the community level. And of course, that's really important. But the level of emphasis that's been given to that by national level governments, I think has been inappropriate, because a lot of the risk is created at those levels. And in a way, I think it's an easy out for higher levels of government in terms of dealing with their responsibilities and helping to manage risk of, say, it's community driven. So we really need to look at it at all scales. We depend on critical infrastructure, which is generally speaking not local, at least where I live. Then there are temporal scales. So they're the risks that we're exposed to right now. But an important aspect of vulnerability and risk is what about the future generations? They aren't born yet. So it's important to ask yourself questions like, what are our duties to them? And in fact, what rights do they have? Which is a really interesting discussion, because beings who do not yet exist, do they have rights, demands that they can put upon us, or do they not? And you can extend this to environmental aspects as well. So this issue of public versus private sector, here in North America, anywhere from 70% to well over 80% of critical infrastructure, which can be considered a public good, is owned by the private sector and run by the private sector. And so this whole notion of public versus private becomes very complex. So the public sector essentially has duties and obligations to citizens because of the social contract that exists between government and those who are governed. But the private sector essentially owes duties to stockholders, people who own that company, and their primary motive is to make a profit, which is a very different kind of duty. And you can talk about social corporate responsibility, which some organizations are getting into. But still, when increasingly, in fact, I would say, public goods, such as critical infrastructure, are owned by the private sector, then the role of the government in terms of how it governs those aspects becomes much more complex. The trend has been, in North America anyway, towards more and more things being owned by the private sector. So the government is selling stuff off. And if you're a libertarian or a right-wing politician, you're pretty happy with that, because you believe in small government and the private sector being the best solution to everything. But I don't think the private sector is the best solution to everything. It creates an ethical tension, an ethical conflict when private sectors run public goods, whether it's a pure public good or an impure public good. So that's an ethical issue, and deals with distribution of power, accountability, and social justice. I wish I had more time to talk about some of these things, but I only have 20 minutes to do this presentation. So the next ethical issue is just to say that doing these exercises, assessing risk and vulnerability, is not an objective exercise. And there's one quote by Paul Slovic, who's written a lot of material on risk and risk perception. He's got a couple of good books out you might want to look up if you're interested. So whoever controls the definition of risk controls the rational solution to the problem at hand. And I think that's a very important notion, because when we do a risk assessment or a vulnerability assessment, I'm using these terms kind of simultaneously as, vulnerability is one component of risk. We also have exposure and, the hazard and so forth. They are really exercises in power and control. And it is important to ask the questions of who is doing the risk assessment. Are they a neutral party? And even if they are not a neutral party, what is their worldview and what are their values? And what are they doing the risk assessment for? For what purpose? And whose risks are being assessed? And what are the risk perceptions of that group of people? So, it's good to ask those 5 questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. And the thing about risk is there are losers and there are winners. So to the degree that risk is socially constructed, there are groups of people who make sets of decisions that create risk in society. And as these decisions are made, there are people who benefit, and maybe it's a private corporation who's polluting the environment and they have a financial benefit to not, cleaning up their pollution, but the people in the local community suffer from that pollution. So that would just be one example, but that's a private sector example. There are governmental examples as well, of course. I just want to show you this graph that you may or may not have seen. So this is an example of risk perception. It's called the white male effect. So this particular study was done in the late 1970s. And it shows what the risk perceptions are of 4 groups of people: white males, non-white males, white females, and non-white females, to a whole series of hazards, ranging from cigarette smoking to commercial air travel, which are on the y-axis. On the x-axis, you have the level of risk perception that goes from number 2, slight risk, 3, moderate risk, 4, high risk. And if you look at the curves, the white males, which is the left-hand curve, is significantly different from the other 3 categories. Again, it would not turn out this way, I would imagine, in India, but this is a US and American survey. And so if you take a look at the characteristics of those group of white males, it resulted actually from about 30% of white males, not from all white males. So actually, if you just took the 30%, the difference would be even more extreme. And those white males were better educated, they had higher incomes, politically conservative, they had high trust in institutions and authorities, and were anti-egalitarian. I think that was the last one. Yeah, that was the last one. So this isn't really about being male and being white. It's really about power, being part of a group that is the elite in society. So if you did this in Sri Lanka or some other part of the world, you could get a similar curve, but it wouldn't be white males, as long as you segregated it by those people who are in positions of power and wealth and authority, the elites in society, and coincidentally are the same group who are those who construct risk. So why is this an ethical issue? It's an ethical issue because what you have is this divide in society between those people who create risk and those people who suffer the negative consequences. And those people who create risk have just a different risk perception, and this affects how they carry out any potential duties and obligations to society as a whole. So this is structural in nature, and any country or society that has larger divisions between the wealthy and the poor will see this in a more pronounced way. Now, I did see a more recent graph of this. This was done about 40 years ago or more. In a more recent graph, the difference between white males and the others seemed to be diminished to me. And I believe this is because of the upward mobility in North America that has been experienced by females and non-white people. But on the other hand, if you still divided it up not by those categories of race and sex, but just the categories of people who are better educated, higher incomes, politically conservative, I believe you would see a similar kind of gap there. A lot of this has to do with the way we frame problems. So depending on how you frame a problem, you will come to different kinds of solutions. And the way we frame problems is a function of our worldview, our values, and the degree to which we benefit from the creation of these problems. So if you're making a lot of money off of something, as you create a risk, then you're going to see it as a lower risk because you're benefiting. And this is just a little figure that I like, is that person, figure didn't show up. So is she turning to the left or to the right? And it just depends how you're looking at it. If you want to read more about frame switching or framing, there's work by Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner, who talks about this more. And framing can result in biased judgments. And since you're students, I thought you might enjoy this particular graphic. So that's a very bright student who is framing an issue in a very good way for him in terms of not doing his homework. The teacher would frame it in a very different way. And as you frame issues, you enhance voices or you silence voices. So in a risk and vulnerability assessment, the question of whose voices are speaking and being heard are critical. And there are various ways running from methodologies to the metrics that are used that enhance voices or silence voices. And to ask the question of whether there is an other involved in this process who exists, they're there, but they're not being heard, and they are invisible or uncared for, then that is an important ethical issue. And a very cultural issue. Some cultures will have strong gender differences, for example, and men's voices will be heard to a much larger degree than women's voices, or it may emphasize, a political difference or a racial difference or a religious difference. And the point I'm making here is that risk and vulnerability are largely socially constructed. So yes, there are strong objective aspects of it, of course, but also the subjective aspects of it are just as important. And both are needed. You need both in order to do an assessment. And the kind of metrics used to measure success, and I have another slide about this, are important. Like, what metrics do you choose and why do you choose them? So if you're taking a quantitative approach, the metrics you choose will largely determine the outcome of the risk assessment and address things like moral values, vested interests, and power structures. Another comment is, there's an expression about emergency plans. It's called the paper plan syndrome. And the paper plan syndrome is when somebody sits down and writes an emergency plan and it's all on paper, but it hasn't been done in a way that involves other stakeholders. And so it's just a piece of paper, a document that is powerless because it only has power if the people who are involved and need it know about it and are going to use it. So the whole notion of process is critical to risk and vulnerability assessment. And the process needs to be one of broad engagement. And the benefits of these things, I think, are often as much or more about the actual process that's used as compared to the final outcome. The next issue is about responsibility. There is a large literature on risk assessment, which mainly exploded, I would say, starting in the middle of the last century. And there's a large literature on ethical decision-making, which goes back thousands of years. If you take a look at these two literatures and the degree to which they overlap, they overlap a tiny, tiny amount. There's almost nothing, only a few papers really written on ethical risk assessment. And I think this largely has to do with the intellectual tradition that the two come from. So one comes from an ancient stream of philosophy going back certainly to the ancient Greeks and Chinese and so forth, whereas risk assessment essentially developed from the insurance industry, from the engineering profession, and from finance. And as it came from these particular professions, it came from a very quantitative approach. It was basically about money before it transferred over to engineering and other places. But it didn't have the background in ethics and morality. And so these two literatures, which are really two sides of the same coin, really haven't integrated to a very large degree. And I think needs to happen to a much greater degree. And it is beginning to happen. And this is just a quote I came across that I thought was a very, very good one by an emperor of Ethiopia. A fourth ethical issue, depending on how the assessment is being done, is treating people as things. So one of the common approaches in doing a risk and vulnerability assessment is to look at all the demographics and statistics in the community. For example, you might look at how buildings are constructed, number of buildings of type A, number of buildings of type B, how many old age homes, how many bridges, how many roads, how many water plants, and so forth. And create a kind of taxonomy of items that can be damaged during a disaster. And if one of those things is like the number of people exposed to floods, for example, then essentially people you create an equivalence between people and things. Now, I'm not saying this isn't a useful exercise to go through. Of course, it's a useful exercise to go through, and you need to do it. At the same time, you need to be aware that people are getting lost in this process. And when you create this equivalence of things with people, then from an ethical point of view, it's useful in a utilitarian analysis. But if you doing a deontological analysis, it's denying people agency and treating them as a means to an end opposed to an end. And therefore that can be an ethical issue. And so it should be augmented by other analyses as well that consider people as people and duties that are owed to them. What metrics are used are critically important, and metrics are underlined by values. Virtually every risk analysis that I've seen, for example, when it assesses risk and is looking at empirical data, like the history of events that have happened, will look at total economic damage. Excuse me. When you look at total economic damage, you are biasing your risk analysis to those people who have a lot of wealth. And that is a metric that is, well, in fact, it's almost invariably chosen. Another potential metric would be the amount of damage as a percentage of wealth. So $1,000 lost to a poor person could be everything, whereas $1,000 lost to a millionaire or a billionaire is nothing. So if you use the metric of damage, which is normalized by wealth or income or GDP or something like that, you actually flip and reverse the importance of the wealthy as compared to the poor. So the metrics that are being used should be, at the very least, transparently discussed, and the values that underlie them expressed. So I'm not saying it's wrong to use total economic impact. It all depends on the purpose of your risk assessment. And if that's a metric that suits the purpose, then that's fine. But at the same time, every risk assessment should have, and especially disaster risk, should have an ethical component that discusses the methodology, the metrics that are used, what the ethics and values are, the result from those particular choices, and how it biases the result of the assessment in terms of its outcomes. I've yet to see a risk assessment that does that. And I think this is one of the singular major flaws in how risk and vulnerability assessments are done within our profession. Other issues are like, what is the value of life? So if you're looking at a multi-metric kind of assessment, you're going to be looking at people who are injured and died and economic consequences. So how do you balance those two things off? And in fact, are all lives of equal value? Many people say yes, but a lot of people say no. We value some lives more than others, like a humanitarian versus a criminal, for example. Or an elderly person compared to a child. The child has many years to live. So should we give greater value to a child as compared to an elderly person? So when you have sort of gross assessments of number of people affected, that kind of detail gets lost in terms of who is affected and how they're affected, and it's important. And then again, if you're doing a quantitative assessment, it depends on data. And there can be important aspects of what communities and people's value for which there is no data. So if you don't have data, is it not part of your risk assessment if you're doing a quantitative assessment? Well, and if it's not there, what does that mean in terms of the value of your assessment? So just taking a look at those things for which you do not have data, but it still may be important. And maybe it's the cultural value of places. Then, the thing is, it's not just about numbers. It's about what we can quantify and what we can't quantify and what's important. And ethical issue number 6 is about lost people. So as we aggregate numbers, typical risk assessments will come up, if it's a quantitative one and say it's a risk index approach, it will take a whole bunch of sub-indices and begin to aggregate them into, perhaps even a single number that policymakers can use for, like what they call a rational assessment of resources. And the usefulness of that to policymakers is obvious. But at the same point, whether you're talking a mean or expected value, those two measures result in people who are lost in the process. People who are lost in the process. And I'll just give, so really what's important are things like critical thresholds. And I'm just going to give one quick example. Suppose, let's think somebody gets almost all of the vitamins they need every day for healthy living, say 90% of the best possible value. So we'll give them a 90% score and they're doing great. They're getting over the minimum number of vitamins for everything. Let's take somebody else who's getting 100% of every vitamin except vitamin C, and they don't get any vitamin C. They'll actually end up, because there's something like 47 vitamins you need, I forget the exact number, you'd actually end up with a score much better than 90%, but you would die of scurvy. Your teeth would fall out, your bones would go crooked, you'd have a horrible life. So the notion of means or totals in vulnerability assessments is very problematical. And other measures, such as peak over thresholds, for example, or identifying critical thresholds that are exceeded, need to be included to augment this often other used approach, which is just to look at means and averages and totals. And finally, are there special duties on the part of government or whoever's doing the risk assessment to certain groups? So duties of care. And if you're a government, you might say, well, we have a special duty of care towards people in old age homes or people in penitentiaries. So there are duties of care. They do not exist perhaps for other groups. So any risk assessment from an ethical point of view should look at these special duties of care, or otherwise those people will have no voice. And you can also think of that from the environment, like duties to the environment. So animals and trees and forests have no voice. The only voice they have is the ones that we, people who may speak for them. So for those who have no voices, whether they're people, because they're part of society which is not being heard, or whether they're the environment, we should try and speak for them. And so in conclusion, I'm just going to say risk and vulnerability assessments are value-laden tools that reflect the purpose of those performing the assessments. They're exercises in power and often maintaining the existing social structures. Methodologies and metrics chosen will largely determine the end result. So if I know who's doing a risk assessment, especially if they have vested interest, I can pretty much tell you what's going to happen. So like we have a big issue in Canada here around a pipeline development that's going on for a number of years. And I saw 2 risk assessments. One was done by the pipeline company and another was done by an environmental group, an NGO. I didn't even need to look at the risk assessments to know that they would be opposite. Okay, they would be opposite. And they were both rational. They were both made sense within the sets of assumptions that were being used by the people doing risk assessment. But those methodologies and metrics that are used, that were chosen, were quite different because their values were different and their purposes were different. And so there are a whole series of ethical issues that should be clarified so that the users of these assessments can understand context. And I'm not saying one way is necessarily right and another way is necessarily wrong. although there are better and worse ways to do it for sure. But to me, the most important part is to, when you do these things, is to think ethically, to think morally, to be aware of your choices, and to be transparent and say what the effects of these are. So that's the end of my brief presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a really interesting presentation for me. And what the examples you were giving, I think I came up with a lot of corresponding examples, which will be very useful for our students. And I think we can just discuss that. Niti, do you want to start, or you want me to?
You can start, Soumya. I'll add in.
So the interesting things which we wanted to do with the exercise which we are doing for the summer school is to bring students from the UK and India to do a risk assessment and to look at composite indicators, not completely do a risk assessment, but to get an idea about multiple indicators with respect to a slum locality very close to our campus called the M Ward. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts that you have, a group coming from a developed country who has never seen the slum areas where we are located. At the same time, we have a bunch of students who've never been to Bombay because it's a batch which has not come to the campus yet. But they do have certain idea about how the circumstances in India are. Some of them have, in the previous exercise, have been to slum localities in their respective hometown. So that's an interesting position where both the groups have to work together, identify their indicators, give weightage to their indicators, which I think from the examples which you have given is going to be a very interesting exercise. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
So my first thought is to beware of paternalistic attitudes. So if you're coming with, and I mean, you know this as well, of course. So if you come from a particular culture, you look things in a particular way, and you're imposing that worldview on the exercise when it may not be appropriate for your culture. So that is a trap that many risk assessments have fallen into, and not just risk assessments, but also programs intended to do disaster risk reduction.
Sure.
And they've failed miserably because of paternalistic approaches that were not appropriate. So the way to avoid that trap is to include a bottom-up process where the communities and the people for whom it's being done to a large degree construct, sort of input their notion of risk. And if you look at like the UN approach to DRR, it has really switched over the past couple of decades, especially from the 1990s, the IDNDR, to a DRR approach which empowers those local communities. So that's one trap to avoid. And you can do this in part, reading narratives and reading stories is a wonderful way, if you are enmeshed in one culture, to try and get a sense for how another culture operates. So whether it's literature or stories of people talking about how disasters affected them, or interviews of people, these are all good ways to avoid that. The other thing is, you mentioned a composite index. So is this an approach which is quantitative and you're coming up with a whole series of metrics which you're going to use to try and create a picture of vulnerability? Is that right?
So yeah, so what they've done is, in the first week, they've already looked at various not theoretical approaches, but like more of a qualitative way of defining vulnerability, trying to understand an event tree and various indicators of vulnerability. Now they are going to see that, the indicators of vulnerability that they have understood from based on their theory, on their readings and discussion, how much of that applicability is already there on the ground. So there are indicators. So there are data sets which we have already done from TIS beforehand. They have already done an exercise of understanding vulnerabilities in Mumbai and in various slum areas. And now they are going to look at how much they have understood the actual ground reality through these indicators. So that's one way of going
I've
about it.
been through exercises like that, and often in class we'll go through an exercise where we try and do that. One of again, the individual layers are exercise to go through, but the traps are in aggregation. The traps are in aggregation. So if, for example, you mentioned weightings, how do you weight one? How do you weight a single parent family versus
Exactly.
people who can't swim and live in the floodplain?
Mhm.
There's actually no way to weight these. There's no way to weight them that is meaningful, because different people will come up with different weights and it's purely subjective. So when you begin to go through an exercise in weighting and aggregating, it's like counting the number of angels who can dance on the head of a pin. It increasingly becomes an exercise that is meaningless. And it's just a process to come up with a number so you can say you did it, as opposed to something which is useful. In a sense, risk assessment is not scientific because it cannot go through the process of validation. So in science, we say, okay, we'll create a hypothesis and we'll test the hypothesis. If you do a risk assessment, you come up with some numbers, it's untestable. So in that sense,
Mhm.
science is a component of what we're doing. It's not a scientific process. So how can you get around this? And I think the way to get around it is just simply not to aggregate and not to try and give weights, but to provide the information to the community at the individual layers. And there's some nice ways of doing this. There's something called the environmental something index. I forget exactly what it's called, but each risk summary is a whole page where they break it down into the individual elements. Do you know the one I'm talking about? And so it provides a snapshot of where the particular exposures and risks are at each individual layer without simply giving an aggregate number. Yeah, that's just my first reflection, my reflections on that.
Sure.
So
Thank you
yeah.
for that, sir. Just to get more example and your thoughts on this, you were mentioning about special duties and how at certain aspect we miss out on important elements which we could have covered within, we should have ideally covered in the risk assessment. So do you think undocumented people, especially if you're looking at the slum locality which we have selected, we have this is an area where a lot of migrant population coming from different parts of the country come in and settle. So they are not documented. They are not, therefore, not entitled to social welfare schemes, which the government has functioning at a state level. So there is a tendency from the government side as well as from the civil society to really miss out on this group. So would that be a suitable example for the aspect you mentioned?
That would be a perfect example. And again, it depends on why you're doing the risk assessment and for whom and for what purpose.
Of course.
So it could be if you might be doing it for a government agency and not including people is appropriate for what you're doing, in which case, the very front of the risk assessment on page 1 and in the executive summary, you should say, this group of people has not been included in this risk assessment for this reason. And therefore, the risk assessment is appropriate for, say, set of purposes A, but not for B. So, I mean, one could make a value judgment that if those people are excluded, then it's like a terrible risk assessment and it's ignoring the lives of people and all lives are of equal value. But that comes from one set of ethical values.
Yes.
And there are many sets of ethical values that are different, but not necessarily wrong. And as long as you acknowledge them and have transparency, then I think what you're doing is okay.
Also, sir, that also brings me to the point of what you mentioned about public and private sector, that we tend to see that whether it is the private sector as well as the public sector in India, there is a tendency to miss out on these undocumented people or the migrant population with the government as well as in the private sector in India. with the private sector, as you clearly pointed out, that it's a very complex setup with respect to their loyalty and their responsibility to their stakeholders. But with the government, and especially in a developing country like India, where the standards of accountability are not as high as some other countries we could see. We do have natural disaster, recurring disasters, where there are government documents which have recognized that the government has failed in certain circumstance, and there's no level of accountability associated with that. So would that be also an important consideration when we talk about public and private sector and their responsibility? Because what you mentioned about the private sector is that the responsibility is shifting towards the private sector. At the same time, the public sector is losing out its responsibility under social contract. But what we see in our country is that we continue with that government control, especially in the disaster sector in terms of response. We still see the government's role to a large extent, but we don't see any accountability. So there is an argument coming up that if the government is not accountable, let's move to the private sector. Let's move to more intervention of private sector, and that's where, which is somewhere associating with what's happening in North America as well. Although we do see in US with FEMA, the government still has a considerable amount of control. But the argument in our country seems to be that we need to move towards more private sector. We haven't seen that in the disaster sector, but I think we're moving in that direction. So do you think that's a difference between the developed and the developing country, or that's a challenge which is there at a global level?
Well, what a great question. I probably need to think about this a lot more, but I can give you my intuitive response. And I live in Canada, in North America, and so that my experience is mainly here, not in a say, developing world. And I think moving to the private sector hasn't worked out too well for us. So the private sector, and yes, there are some people who are idealistic and so forth, but it's mainly driven by financial interests and economic growth. And so those are antithetical, I think, to what you're talking about. It hasn't worked out well for us, and it has created increases in the gap between the wealthy and the poor, and I think has resulted in negative consequences for society in terms of our disaster risk. Now, the government has a vested interest towards those people who can vote and those people who can donate money to political parties.
True.
And so you're talking about the undocumented migrants are neither of those. So both of those approaches has a systemic or a structural problem in terms of dealing with that issue. And where the barriers are structural, it's enormously difficult to overcome them. So it seems to me that what approach might work, civil society. So if you have a civil society where this becomes an important issue to them, then that can create solutions through NGOs, for example, or political or economic pressure on government and the private sector, which will then become a factor in their decision-making. So I really think the normative values of civil society are what have to drive addressing that issue. That's my first response to that.
Thank you for that, sir. Just another example, which
I just want to add. Sorry,
Yeah,
I just want to add something. Want to add on another question to what Soumya has asked. So, apart from civil society, is there no other way that we can hold the private sector accountable? Like, have you seen any other example from Canada where you've been able to hold the private sector accountable? Where civil, other than civil society, who all are important for this?
So I- the world is changing in some really interesting ways, and disaster risk has been changing over the decades. So it is becoming, because our world is becoming more of a complex system, more interconnected and so forth, we're creating new layers of disaster risk on top of the old
Yeah.
ones. Um, to me, privatization is, like we're seeing the whole neoliberal approach, which is so strong here in the West, is going in the wrong direction from that perspective. And I understand
Mhm.
all the notion of libertarianism and the emphasis on individual liberties and so forth. But as the private sector becomes more important in the construction of risk for communities and peoples, I see the need for a larger role in government to monitor and control the private sector in terms of how they manage public goods. So for that reason, and I know their government is not perfect. I used to work in the government, and there are all sorts of problems, and you have moral hazard and inefficiencies and things like that. But it seems to me that the role of government needs to be stronger, not weaker, and not just government at local levels, but increasingly at larger scales and international scales, because our problems are
Exactly.
international. Um, I'm not sure if I'm losing the. Could you ask that question one more time? I think I'm starting to get lost in the answer.
No, I think that's perfectly. So I just added on to what Soumya was asking, that we are talking about accountability, and but like apart from CSOs, doing the civil society organization, don't we have any other way of fixing the issue of accountability?
So the private sector will be accountable for two reasons. One is people who buy the products, and the other is government who exerts control over them. So people buying their products, there's this whole notion of buy ethically. And so again, that's in civil society. And so if those sorts of notions are promoted, that will influence the private sector, to get more into corporate social responsibility type of stuff. And increasingly, I think the government should have a strong role in terms of monitoring how the private sector operates. And that is a situation that is rife with complexities and difficulties, I know. But to me, the risks of having a private sector that is unfettered are much greater than the risks of a private sector that is over controlled. How on earth are we going to deal with climate change and issues like
Exactly.
that if we don't have a broad global coalition of government and private sector and civil society?
True, true, true. So just two questions from the paper which you've shared with us. So you've talked about the difference between ethical risks and moral hazards in your paper. So I just wanted to, if you could draw out the distinction between these two in the context of COVID, an example during COVID times, maybe from Canada, that would help students understand the difference between ethical risk and moral hazards much more in a much more clear manner.
Okay. So a corporation that behaves badly and immorally and say goes bankrupt, that's ethical risk. So they've behaved badly ethically and they have suffered as a result. So maybe it's been malfeasance or corruption on the part of their senior executives or whatever. And ethical risk, and politicians too, like politicians behave badly, that can destroy their careers. Although if you look at Trump, maybe not, I don't know. So little value to throw in there, sorry. Moral hazard is something quite different. So moral hazard refers to being benefited by having, okay, it deals with the socialization of risk. So the socialization of risk is something like Medicare, where you have a government program that helps everybody. And disaster assistance schemes are similar, whereas if you suffer a disaster, we will compensate you for your loss. So if you live in a society with Medicare, maybe you don't worry so much about being a smoker or doing activities that are high risk because you like them, because, okay, if I'm injured, I'm not going to go bankrupt. My medical care will be paid for by the government. If I break my leg or if I end up in hospital. Maybe it's okay for me to live by a floodplain because if I get flooded, the government's going to pay for rebuilding my house. That's socialization of risk. And that encourages people making risky decisions.
Yes.
So that's what moral hazard is about. And it's a real problem for the insurance industry. So they have to be careful of that. So because as a society, well, society I'm in anyway, we have a Medicare system and we're socialized to we're a mixture, but we have a lot of social programs. So it creates moral hazard inevitably. And the position you have to take is that it is more important that we have a society which cares for the vulnerable and takes care of its citizens than it is to have one which doesn't suffer from moral hazard, but just lets people fail. So it's sort of the price you pay for having a social program, which is to the benefit of society and people overall.
Thank you for that, sir. One question I had from one of the subparts which you mentioned in the paper was with regard to considering emotions when it comes to assessment, when it comes to decision making. In the context of emotions, are we moving into a direction where the idea of affective equality, which looks into solidarity, which looks into love and care, comes from a very strong feminist background of affective equality? So would you suggest that we need to move into that direction where we kind of integrate this isolated idea of affective equality with disaster justice as well and disaster decision making?
We need both sides. If we're strictly cognitive machines, then that's, well, number one, we're not.
Yeah.
Number two, if we try to be, then you can end up in a horrible place. But at the same time, if you just use your emotions, then society would disintegrate into everybody fighting with everybody. So you really, you need both. You need both. So we need to have, I think, excuse me, analytical processes in place that we use to try and understand the ethical and moral aspects of situations. And at the same time, we need to recognize the importance of our feelings, of love, of caring ethics, like you're talking about from that feminist tradition. So women like Gilligan, for example, were extremely important in terms of, I think, identifying the problems with the traditional Western approach to ethics, which is very much rooted in just logic and rationality and acknowledging the importance of feelings and emotions. So I think it's our, and different, you know what, this gets so complicated. If you come from a strong faith-based background, you're going to have one perspective on it. If you come from a more secular background, you're going to look at it differently. But we all have intuitions and feelings and notions of what is right and wrong. So we need to take those values, those worldviews, and inject them into an analytical process, which allows for us to create a rigor to our ethical decision making. So I see, like, which is more important to your car, the wheels or the engine? Okay.
Niti, do you want to add more questions?
Yeah, I was just so going through your the discussion that we had in your presentation, and we've spoken about the various 7 to 8 ethical issues over here. Which issues do you think are more would stand out more in a developing country like, or a middle and low income country like India, and which are more like, which would you say are not applicable or would take a backseat? Can you give?
So
I was just listening to you and I was saying, okay, these are like globally applicable, but what would be like more applicable to scenario?
my first thought is you guys would be much better able to answer that question than I would. And if I tried to, I would be falling into the trap of paternalism,
Okay.
and speak about a culture for which I really don't know that well. So I'm going to leave it to you to answer that question.
So, do you want to answer that question?
No, I actually felt that all of them do apply. The level and the issues which you consider would vary in
Yeah.
a developed and a developing country. But all these points which
Mhm.
Sir has raised will definitely apply in a developed and developing country. In fact, we were talking about the frame switching.
Switching, yeah.
Yeah, and also one example where we were talking about how industries are located in such a space where people are dependent on those industries, and therefore they are okay with living in a area which is physically very vulnerable. I think M Ward is a very good example for that, because that's a ward which has we have a chemical factory located right next to it. We have a dumping yard located right there. And the people who are living there are all people whose livelihood are dependent on these industries in some way or the other. So we've had cases of fire reported in these dumping ground and seen as a massive hazard. So the approach of the slightly well-off people living in M Ward, so slightly well-off colonies and residential areas living in the area, they don't want that dumping ground to be there. While if you speak to people living in the slums, because their lives are dependent on that dumping ground in terms of segregation and waste management, they don't seem to have any problem with that. In fact, they get quite restrictive of any kind of changes which are to be brought about in management of those resources. So I would say these principles apply, but the issues, the context, as one of the first few things said, it varies, and that creates different dimensions, which I hope the students will get an idea about, considering we've shared video content with them, sir, about the kind of work which we have done in the past in the M Board. So with regard to sewage, with regard to education, child protection. So we've shared videos with them so that, I mean, they can't physically go there. So we give them a glimpse of how the issues, specific issues are there. So giving them a feel of the field is what we have tried to do. So we are hoping that really works out well for them to get an idea.
Yeah, the thing about so many of these ethical issues, there's no right or it's not like mathematics or physics. There isn't a right answer and a wrong answer. They're just different answers for different people. And framing can be so important. Like I was just thinking about that example you gave. So it could be framed just as, should they be living there, or should that dump be there or not be there? So that's one way to frame it. But you could go to a broader framing and take a look at the lives of the people. And are there other ways to provide them with good lives that doesn't require them to live beside the dumps? That would be a different way of framing it.
Yes.
You know,
and it'll really change your approach to deal with the issue also.
Yeah. When you look at a lot of problems, it can be overwhelming when you take a look at the complexities and the barriers which stop you from moving forward. But there's this thing called historical futures, which is a different way of looking at it. So historical futures, you imagine the future you want, okay? And then you say, what would it take to get there?
Right.
So as opposed to saying, well, if we try and move forward in this direction, this direction, this direction, then we have these barriers, that barriers, those barriers. We can't do any of that, it's too hard. Like I say, this is the place where we want to be. And what would it take to get there? Then sometimes that will provide a level of clarity in terms of appropriate frames and pathways that is hard to achieve by being immersed in the present.
Nidhi, do you have a follow-up question?
Right.
Thank you so much, sir. That
Thank
was really interesting for me, for my classes as well. There's a lot of conversations, a lot of
Insights into-
examples
Yeah.
which have come up, which will be extremely useful. And I'm sure our students also from both the groups will be able to reflect and add on to these points as well. So thank you so much for taking out time for us at such a short notice.
Oh, you're very welcome. Would it be possible for me to get a copy of the recording?
Sure.
Yeah.
May I
Enter-
just stop the recording now?
Yeah.
Can I just stop the recording? I think we